Colonial Williamsburg, the first 100 years, it's a brand new exhibit opening at the Art Museums of Colonial Williamsburg that charts the Foundation's 100 years from 1926 to 2026. The exhibit itself is chronological, taking you from actually before the restoration starts, when the capital moves from Williamsburg to Richmond, to the present day. One of the things that we found very important about this is to include the fact that Williamsburg was a living and breathing community even before the restoration started, and still remains that today in the 21st century.
We had to figure out how we were going to tell the story within the confines of the gallery, how we were going to tell the story of 100 plus years of Williamsburg's history in these spaces, and what objects would help us tell that story from multiple angles.
Certainly, one of the most challenging parts of creating this exhibit was what to tell. What stories do we want to tell, and how can we tell them throughout the gallery space itself? 100 years lends itself to so many incredible stories. But during the research, we were able to pick out certain stories and certain places within the historic area that helped to propel the exhibition forward.
This is the Bodleian plate, and it was actually really pivotal to Colonial Williamsburg's restoration of the town. It is a copper plate engraving, and it depicts buildings in Williamsburg, including the Wren Building at the College of William and Mary, as well as the Governor's Palace and Capitol Building here in Williamsburg. It depicted buildings that we didn't have images of or drawings of from the 18th century. When we found this plate in the collection of the Bodleian Library in 1929, we were able to use this to refine some of those details that had already been designed, and which would have actually been wrong if we had gone forward with the restoration. For instance, at the Governor's Palace, we had no surviving 18th century image depicting the front facade or elevation of the building. We had floor plans and we had the archaeological evidence, but we didn't know what it looked like above ground. And this is where the Bodleian plate comes into play and is really important because it shows details that we were able to replicate. Things like the steepness of the roof, the balustrade around the roof, the balcony, even things in the landscape like the flanking outbuildings, the height of the garden walls, and the garden itself. The early architects and architectural historians were really at the forefront of the field, and without their work, I don't think we would have such an accurate reconstruction of the town.
This is a half baluster from a historic house in James City County. This is a baluster from a building called the Mayo House that was originally in the city of Williamsburg. And these are going to be on display in the exhibit that we're preparing for Colonial Williamsburg, the first 100 years. Early in the history of the Foundation, paint was researched by carefully scraping through existing paint layers to expose swatches of early color. And this was conducted primarily by a woman named Susan Higginson Nash. She was a member of the earliest iteration of the restoration team, and she was carefully going through the buildings and using a razor blade and just very slowly and thoughtfully scraping through these paint layers to expose the colors. And for many decades, that is how the Foundation continued to research the colors in our historic buildings. But I manage our analytical lab now, and the technology has really advanced. What I'm holding here is another part of our architectural fragments collection. This is a paint sample. So these are tiny chips of paint that are mounted in a resin cube. And what I do essentially is I collect tiny paint chips with a scalpel from one of our historic buildings. I mount it in one of these clear cubes of resin, and then I examine it under a high-powered microscope at magnifications from 100 to 1,000 times. And what I'm able to do is see all of the layers that have been applied over time. And we've learned that it's actually much more accurate than these early techniques of scraping. We are able to identify a lot more layers than we once were, and using more advanced scientific analysis, we're able to better understand how these paints changed color over time. So this brings us a more vibrant, colorful palette than we had earlier, because now we understand that certain pigments darken, some fade, some even yellow. So we're able to kind of reverse engineer some of those paints and come up with a more accurate final color. While the field of paint analysis has really evolved over 100 years, over the next 100 years of the foundation, we know it's going to continue to advance. We always save our paint samples so that in the future they can be pulled and used again for further analysis without removing any material. We know that we're going to continue refining our techniques and learning even more about historic paints and colors, and this is going to in turn help us better understand our buildings and provide a more accurate representation of 18th century life at the foundation.
In front of me, I have two mending pieces of a single window pane that were excavated from the Custis Square site, home of John Custis, an early 18th century planter and politician and a prolific gardener. This glass is something called crown glass. What makes this piece of glass important is that the two connecting pieces were found during two excavations by two different generations of archaeologists, almost 60 years apart. In 1964, this larger piece was excavated from the bottom of a well at Custis Square. The smaller piece was recovered more recently during an excavation for the gardens at Custis Square. Archaeologists returned to the site 60 years after it was first dug with different questions. In 1964, our primary question had to do with the architecture of Custis Square, finding the house that John Custis built and the outbuildings built around it. It was just a bonus that we found two wells at the same time, and that's what made this such a productive dig. But what we know about John Custis is that he was most remembered for the formal gardens that he built at Custis Square. And in 1964, archaeology was not up to the task of finding gardens and properly analyzing the botanical remains that came out of it. And so this site was banked for future excavation. It took 60 years for us to get there, and in the interim, we had access to and were able to develop the technologies that allowed us to use ground-penetrating radar, LIDAR, magnetometry, all of those things that allow us to assess a piece of property that is almost 4 acres in size. So in 2019, when we came back, it was both to look at the garden and also to try to fill in the other people who lived on this site, the enslaved people who kept the garden running, who planted the garden, who worked in John Custis's house, and who were integral to the story of what happened on this site. When we go back to excavate a site again and recover artifacts that mend in this way, it reminds me that we are not just adding to the story, but we are connecting old stories to new stories in such a way that we continue the thread and we continue the work of the researchers who have undertaken this work over the last century.
Come together and show that they really are part of the same object.
It's like, yes, I'm this one. I know all of you.
While there are many fantastic artifacts here on view in the gallery, in the art museums here at Colonial Williamsburg, the most important object is, of course, the historic area. This is the area in which was restored starting in the 1920s and 30s, but continues to be restored and rethought all the way to the present day in the 21st century. The buildings there are the most cherished thing here at Colonial Williamsburg.
One of the things that really struck me as we worked on the exhibit was how important research and attention to detail was from the very, very beginning of the foundation. So this detail extended to lampposts and fence posts and curbs, to how do you hide a road so it doesn't obstruct the 18th century atmosphere you're trying to create. They didn't talk about restorations of buildings being complete until their surroundings were complete, so the gardens, the interiors, and the buildings. And each element of those recreations or restorations had to be documented. One of the things I hope that people walk away from the exhibit understanding is our motto, that the future may learn from the past, that can be something we can apply broadly, but how it's really driven the mission here at Colonial Williamsburg over the past 100 years.
Another sort of surprising thing that we stumbled upon is in 1939, John D. Rockefeller requested sort of an ultimate plan of the completion of the historic area. Now today in the 21st century, we don't really view the historic area as ever really being complete, but we are always building upon the foundation that was laid by those early preservation architects and historians and curators that came before us starting in the 1920s and 30s, and we're constantly building upon the work that they laid for us.